Some men build their wealth on the backs of others, but every empire built on suffering is destined to crumble. The Missouri sun blazed mercilessly over the sprawling Whitmore plantation, its golden rays illuminating rows upon rows of towering corn stalks that stretched toward the horizon like a green ocean. The year was 1871, 6 years after the end of the Civil War, yet for many in these borderlands the old ways died hard. Thomas Whitmore stood on his manor's wraparound porch, a glass of bourbon in his weathered hand, surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself untouchable. At 52, he carried the bearing of Southern aristocracy despite Missouri's complex allegiances during the war. His plantation had survived Sherman's march, Reconstruction's upheavals, and the changing tides of a nation trying to heal its wounds. "Martha," he bellowed toward the house, his voice cutting through the humid afternoon air. "Bring me the ledger." Martha Whitmore emerged from the shadowed interior, her once beautiful face now etched with lines of silent endurance. At 45, she moved with the careful grace of a woman who had learned to navigate her husband's volatile moods. The leather-bound ledger trembled slightly in her hands as she approached. "The harvest begins tomorrow," Thomas said, not bothering to look at his wife as he snatched the book from her grasp. "We'll need every able body in those fields. The Chicago buyers are expecting our delivery by month's end." Down in the workers' quarters, a collection of weathered cabins that spoke of better days and broken promises, a different conversation was taking place. Despite the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, Thomas Whitmore had found ways to keep his labor force tied to the land through debt, intimidation, and the simple reality that most of his workers had nowhere else to go. Sarah Washington, a woman of 28 with calloused hands and eyes that held both strength and wariness, sat on the steps of her small cabin, mending a torn work dress by the fading light. Around her, other women prepared for what they knew would be back-breaking weeks ahead. "Mr. Whitmore came by this morning," whispered Rose, a younger woman barely 20, her voice heavy with dread. "Said we'd be working 16-hour days once the harvest starts." 16 hours, Sarah. Sarah's needle paused in its work. She had seen enough harvests, endured enough of Whitmore's employment contracts, that bound them through fabricated debts and legal manipulations that kept them enslaved in all but name. "We ain't free, are we?" Rose continued, her voice breaking. "Ain't really free at all." The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson that seemed to mirror the simmering tensions throughout the region. Unknown to the residents of the Whitmore plantation, a figure watched from the treeline, a man whose reputation had spread like wildfire across the frontier. Jesse James sat astride his horse, his keen blue eyes taking in every detail of the plantation's layout. At 24 he had already become a legend, his name whispered in saloons and sheriff's offices from Missouri to Texas. Some called him a hero, others a terrorist. To Jesse the distinctions mattered less than the simple truth he had learned during the war. Sometimes justice required taking the law into your own hands. His brother Frank shifted restlessly beside him. "Jesse, this ain't our fight. Whitmore's got connections. Political ones." "Every fight against tyranny is our fight, Frank," Jesse replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "War might be over, but the battle for what's right ain't." As darkness fell over the plantation, Sarah Washington found herself unable to sleep. Through her thin cabin walls, she could hear the restless movements of her neighbors, women and their children who faced another dawn of exploitation disguised as employment. The corn stood ready for harvest, golden and full, but Sarah knew that none of the wealth it would generate would find its way into their hands. She stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air, and noticed something unusual: fresh horse tracks near the creek that bordered their quarters. Tracks that hadn't been there that morning. In the distance, an owl called across the darkness, but Sarah wondered if what she had heard was truly a bird at all. Before we continue, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. We love knowing where our viewers are from. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us keep going. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Now enjoy the story. Freedom isn't granted, it's taken by those brave enough to reach for it. The next morning arrived with the oppressive weight of Missouri humidity and Thomas Whitmore's barked orders echoing across the plantation grounds. By dawn, the workers were already assembled near the cornfields, their faces reflecting the weariness of people who knew what lay ahead. "Listen up," Whitmore shouted, positioning himself on an overturned crate so he could look down on the gathered workers. "We've got 3 weeks to bring in this harvest. Every stalk every year. The Chicago grain merchants are paying premium prices this year, and I intend to deliver." Sarah Washington stood among the crowd, her jaw set in grim determination. Around her, she could see the resignation in her neighbors' faces, the same expression she had worn for too many years. But something had changed overnight, something she couldn't quite name. Daily quotas are posted on the barn, Whitmore continued. Anyone who falls short will have their wages docked accordingly. Anyone who refuses to work. He let the threat hang in the air like smoke from a cigarette. As the workers dispersed toward the fields, Sarah caught sight of Martha Whitmore watching from an upstairs window. For just a moment their eyes met, and Sarah saw something unexpected in the plantation owner's wife's expression: shame. The first day of harvest was brutal. Under the scorching sun, the women and handful of men worked with the desperate efficiency of people who had no choice. Sarah's hands, already tough from years of labor, began to crack and bleed as she pulled ear after ear of corn from the stalks. The overseer, a cruel man named Briggs who carried a riding crop and wasn't shy about using it, patrolled the rows like a predator. "Move faster, girl," he barked at Rose, who was struggling to keep up despite the heat that was making her dizzy. This ain't a church social. But as the sun reached its zenith, something extraordinary happened. A commotion arose from the eastern edge of the field, where several workers had stopped their labor and were pointing toward the horizon. 3 riders approached at a steady pace, their horses kicking up small clouds of dust in their wake. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that these weren't ordinary travelers. They rode with the confidence of men who feared neither authority nor consequence. The lead rider sat tall in his saddle, his hat pulled low over his face, but something about his bearing commanded attention. Thomas Whitmore emerged from the shade of his porch, his face darkening as he recognized the implications of armed men approaching his property. "Briggs," he called out, "get the rifle from the house." But the riders had already reached the edge of the field, and the lead man raised his hand in what appeared to be a peaceful gesture. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the hot air. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore. I'm Jesse James and these are my associates. We'd like a word with you about your employment practices." A murmur rippled through the workers like wind through wheat. Jesse James, the name carried weight throughout Missouri and beyond. Sarah felt her heart begin to race, though whether from fear or hope she couldn't say. Whitmore's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. "This is private property, James. You and your men need to move along." Jesse dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. Frank and their companion, a quiet man named Cole Younger, remained mounted but alert. "See, that's where you and I disagree, Mr. Whitmore. When I see American citizens being worked like slaves, that becomes everybody's business." "These people work for wages," Whitmore protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Voluntary employment. All legal and proper." Jesse walked closer, his spurs jingling softly with each step. "Is that so? Tell me, how much are you paying these folks for 16 hours of backbreaking labor?" When Whitmore hesitated, Jesse turned to address the workers directly. "How much are you earning, ma'am?" he asked Sarah, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Sarah glanced nervously at Whitmore, then at Briggs who was fingering his riding crop menacingly. But something in Jesse's steady gaze gave her courage. $2 a week, she said quietly. Minus deductions for housing, food, and other expenses. Other expenses? Jesse's voice carried a dangerous edge. Debt payments, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. For supplies we bought last winter. For medical care when my daughter was sick. The debt? It never seems to get smaller. Jesse nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "And how much would this harvest be worth, Mr. Whitmore? To those Chicago buyers you mentioned?" The plantation owner's silence was answer enough. Jesse turned back to the workers, many of whom had now stopped their labor entirely to listen. "Folks, you're looking at a crop worth easily $15,000. Maybe 20. And you're being paid scraps while this man profits from your labor." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Now, I ask you, does that sound like freedom to you?" The tension in the air was palpable. Sarah could see Whitmore's hand inching toward the gun at his hip, could see Briggs calculating his odds against 3 armed men. But she could also see something else in the faces around her, the first stirrings of defiance. "What are you proposing, Mr. James?" she heard herself ask. Jesse smiled then, an expression that was both gentle and fierce. "I'm proposing that you folks get a fair share of what your labor produces. I'm proposing that you work for yourselves instead of making a rich man richer." "This is robbery," Whitmore sputtered. "I'll have the law on you." "The law?" Jesse's laugh was cold. "Mr. Whitmore, you've been robbing these people for years. I'm just evening the scales. As if responding to some silent signal, Frank and Cole dismounted, their hands resting casually on their weapons. The message was clear. This wasn't a request. Here's what's going to happen, Jesse announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. These folks are going to finish bringing in this harvest. But when it's sold, they're going to receive a fair wage for their work. Half the proceeds, minus reasonable expenses for equipment and transportation. You can't be serious. Whitmore protested. Dead serious, Jesse replied. And Mr. Whitmore? Those debts your workers supposedly owe? Consider them forgiven. Fresh start for everyone. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes. Around her, she could see the same emotion reflected in the faces of her neighbors. For the first time in years, hope seemed like more than just a word. But she also knew that challenging men like Thomas Whitmore came with consequences. And as she watched Jesse James facing down one of the most powerful landowners in the county, she realized that whatever happened next would change all their lives forever. True courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite the consequences. The standoff in the cornfield stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Thomas Whitmore's face had progressed from pale to red to a dangerous shade of purple as he processed Jesse James's ultimatum. Around them, the workers stood frozen between hope and terror, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would define their futures. You're making a grave mistake, James, Whitmore said through gritted teeth. I have friends in Jefferson City. Political connections. The governor himself. The governor can take his concerns up with me personally, Jesse interrupted, his voice calm but steely. But right now we're talking about these folks and the wages they've earned through their sweat. Sarah Washington found herself stepping forward, surprising even herself with her boldness. Mr. James, what about our families? Our children? If we go along with this, Whitmore will make sure we can never work anywhere in the county again. Jesse turned to her with an expression of understanding that spoke of his own struggles against powerful enemies. Ma'am, what's your name? Sarah. Sarah Washington. Sarah, I won't lie to you. Standing up to men like Whitmore comes with risks. But living under his boot for the rest of your life, that's not living at all. That's just surviving. He gestured toward the vast cornfield. Look around you. You and these folks created all this wealth with your hands. Don't you think you deserve more than scraps from his table? Martha Whitmore appeared at the edge of the gathering, having approached so quietly that her presence startled everyone. Her face was drawn, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He's right, Thomas. Her husband whirled around as if she had struck him. Martha, get back to the house. But Martha stood her ground, something Sarah had never seen her do before. I've watched this for 6 years, Thomas. Watched you call it employment, while you worked these people like animals. Watched you cheat them with debts that never decreased no matter how much they paid. You don't understand business, Thomas began. I understand right from wrong. Martha's voice cracked like a whip. And this is wrong. The emotional weight of the moment seemed to galvanize the workers. Rose stepped up beside Sarah, then another woman, then another. Soon, nearly all of the field hands had formed a loose semicircle around Jesse and his men. We'll do it, Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the field. We'll finish this harvest, but we want our fair share. Briggs, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. You folks are making a big mistake. There are ways to deal with troublemakers and... His words were cut short as Cole Younger smoothly drew his revolver, not pointing it at anyone but making his readiness clear. Friend, I'd be very careful about the next words that come out of your mouth. Jesse raised his hand, calling for calm. There's no need for threats here. This is about justice, not violence. He turned back to Whitmore. Here's what we're going to do. My men and I will stay on the property until the harvest is complete and sold. We'll make sure everyone gets treated fairly. You're turning my own property against me, Whitmore protested. Your property is the land and the buildings, Jesse replied. These people aren't your property and neither is the work they do. Over the next 2 weeks, the Whitmore plantation was transformed in ways that went far beyond the harvesting of corn. Jesse and his men set up a camp near the workers' quarters, and their presence changed the entire dynamic of the operation. No longer did Briggs patrol the fields with his riding crop. No longer did workers collapse from exhaustion without anyone caring for them. Instead, Jesse implemented a system where the workers took regular breaks, received adequate water and food, and most importantly, were treated with basic human dignity. He even convinced some of the local shopkeepers in town to extend credit to the workers based on their upcoming harvest payments, credit that wasn't tied to Whitmore's exploitative debt system. Sarah found herself working alongside Jesse during those long days, and she was struck by how different he was from his reputation. The newspapers portrayed him as a cold-blooded outlaw, but she saw a man driven by a deep sense of justice, someone who couldn't stand to see the weak exploited by the powerful. "Why do you do this?" she asked him one evening as they sat by the creek after another long day in the fields. "You could be anywhere doing anything. Why risk your life for people you barely know?" Jesse was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the water as fireflies began to dance in the gathering dusk. "During the war, I saw what happens when good people do nothing while evil flourishes. I saw neighbor turn against neighbor, brother against brother. When the fighting stopped, I thought the hatred would stop too." He shook his head. "But men like Whitmore, they just found new ways to oppress people. New ways to profit from suffering. And you decided to fight back. Someone has to." Jesse's voice carried a weariness that seemed far older than his 24 years. "Maybe I can't change the whole world, but I can change what's happening right here, right now." As the harvest neared completion, word of the situation at the Whitmore plantation spread throughout the county. Some folks viewed Jesse as a hero standing up for the oppressed. Others saw him as a dangerous criminal who needed to be stopped. The local sheriff, caught between political pressure from Whitmore's allies and the undeniable justice of what was happening, chose to stay away from the plantation entirely. But Sarah knew that the real test would come when it was time to sell the harvest and distribute the proceeds. Whitmore had been unnaturally quiet for the past week, and she sensed he was planning something. Men with his kind of power rarely accepted defeat gracefully. On the night before the corn was scheduled to be loaded onto wagons bound for the railroad depot, Sarah found Jesse standing guard at the edge of the camp, his rifle cradled in his arms as he watched the shadows. "You're expecting trouble?" she said. "Always," he replied without taking his eyes off the darkness. "But especially now. Tomorrow is when Whitmore gets his last chance to stop us." "And if he tries?" Jesse's jaw tightened. "Then we'll be ready." As Sarah headed back to her cabin, she realized that somewhere during these 2 weeks, she had stopped thinking of Jesse James as an outlaw and started thinking of him as something else entirely. A man willing to bind his own fate to the cause of freedom for others. Tomorrow would prove whether that choice would lead to triumph or tragedy. Some victories cost more than defeats, but the price of liberty is always worth paying. The morning of the final confrontation dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds rolling in from the west like an omen of the storm to come. By sunrise, the last of the corn had been loaded onto wagons, and the entire harvest sat ready for transport to the railroad depot in town. But everyone on the plantation knew that Thomas Whitmore wouldn't allow Jesse James's plan to proceed without a fight. Sarah Washington stood with the other workers near the loaded wagons, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. In just a few hours, they would either receive the fair wages Jesse had promised, or everything would come crashing down around them. Jesse emerged from his tent, fully armed and alert. Frank and Cole flanked him, their faces grim with the knowledge that today would likely bring violence. As they approached the main group, Jesse caught Sarah's eye and nodded, a gesture that somehow conveyed both reassurance and apology for what might be necessary. "Folks," Jesse addressed the assembled workers, "we all knew this day would come. Whitmore's not going to let us walk away with what we've earned without making one last play." He paused, scanning the faces around him. "Anyone who wants to leave now, no one will think less of you. This isn't your fight." But nobody moved. After 2 weeks of being treated with dignity and respect, after glimpsing what freedom might actually look like, none of the workers were willing to go back to the old ways. "We're with you," Sarah said, speaking for all of them. "Whatever comes." It was then that they heard the sound of approaching horses. Many horses. From the direction of town, a dust cloud rose against the gray sky, and as it drew closer, they could make out the shapes of at least a dozen riders. Thomas Whitmore emerged from his house, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. He had clearly been expecting this. "I told you I had connections, James," he called out. "Sheriff Morrison and his deputies are here to arrest you for trespassing and theft." But as the riders drew closer, Jesse's expression remained calm. "That's not Sheriff Morrison," he said quietly to Frank. "Morrison's got a limp from the war. That man rides too straight in the saddle." The lead rider pulled up just outside the plantation gate, and when he removed his hat, Sarah saw a face she didn't recognize, a hard-looking man with cold eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to violence. "I'm Deputy Marshal Clayton," the man announced. I'm here on behalf of certain interested parties to resolve this situation. Jesse stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. And what situation would that be, Marshal? The situation where you and your men are interfering with lawful commerce and threatening the property rights of a law-abiding citizen. Clayton's voice carried the authority of federal law, but something in his manner suggested he was more mercenary than lawman. Property rights? Jesse's voice hardened. These folks aren't property, Marshal. Slavery ended 6 years ago. Nobody said anything about slavery, Clayton replied smoothly. But Mr. Whitmore has legal contracts with these workers, and you're interfering with those contracts. It was then that Martha Whitmore surprised everyone for the second time in 2 weeks. She walked out of the house carrying a leather satchel, her face set with determination. Thomas, she called to her husband, show them the contracts. Whitmore's face went pale. Martha, get back inside. Show them, Thomas. Her voice was steel. Show them how you've been cheating these people. When Whitmore hesitated, Martha opened the satchel and pulled out a stack of papers. I've been keeping records, Thomas. Real records. Not the doctored books you show the tax assessor. She turned to Clayton. These contracts are fraudulent. The debts are manufactured. These people have been working without fair compensation for years. Clayton's confident demeanor faltered as he examined the documents Martha thrust into his hands. Jesse took advantage of the moment to address the workers directly. Folks, you've got a choice to make right now. You can take what little Whitmore's willing to give you and go back to the way things were, or you can stand up for what's right and claim what you've earned. Sarah stepped forward first, followed by Rose, then the others. One by one, they positioned themselves between the wagons of corn and Clayton's men. We earned this harvest, Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the plantation grounds. We planted it, tended it, and picked it. And we're not leaving without our fair share. Clayton looked uncertainly from the documents in his hands to the determined faces of the workers to Jesse James, who stood ready for whatever came next. Finally, he made his decision. Mr. Whitmore, it appears your contracts aren't worth the paper they're printed on. These folks have a right to fair compensation for their labor. He folded the papers and handed them back to Martha. I suggest you work this out among yourselves. Thomas Whitmore's face contorted with rage. You can't do this. I have investments. Debts of my own. Then you should have thought of that before you built your wealth on other people's suffering, Jesse replied quietly. What happened next would be talked about in Missouri for years to come. The corn harvest was sold at the railroad depot for $18,000, more than anyone had expected. True to his word, Jesse ensured that the workers received half of the proceeds, minus reasonable expenses for transportation and equipment. For most of them, it was more money than they had seen in their entire lives. But the story's true conclusion came 3 months later, when Sarah Washington used her share of the harvest money to purchase a small farm of her own. Rose and several other families did the same, forming a cooperative that helped them support each other through the challenges of independent farming. Martha Whitmore left her husband and moved to Kansas City, where she used her portion of the plantation's assets to establish a school for freed slaves and their children. Thomas Whitmore, faced with bankruptcy and public disgrace, eventually sold what remained of his land and disappeared from Missouri entirely. As for Jesse James, he vanished into the autumn landscape as suddenly as he had appeared, but not before sharing one final conversation with Sarah by the creek where they had first talked about justice and freedom. What will you do now? She asked him. Keep fighting the good fight, Jesse replied. There are too many Thomas Whitmores in this world, and not enough people willing to stand up to them. And what about you? Don't you ever want to settle down, have a normal life? Jesse smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. I bound my fate to this cause the day I decided that some things are worth more than personal happiness. Maybe someday there won't be a need for men like me. Until then. He mounted his horse and rode away into the gathering dusk, leaving behind a legacy that was more complex than the newspaper accounts would ever capture. He was an outlaw, yes, but he was also something else. A man who had chosen to bind his own hands in service of freeing others. Years later, when Sarah's granddaughter asked her about those dramatic weeks in 1871, Sarah would always end the story the same way. Sometimes freedom isn't given, child. Sometimes it has to be taken by people brave enough to risk everything for what's right. And sometimes, the most dangerous outlaws are the ones fighting for justice. The Whitmore plantation became a symbol throughout Missouri of what could happen when ordinary people found the courage to stand up against oppression. And though Jesse James's methods were controversial, none could argue with the results. For the first time in their lives, the workers who had labored under Thomas Whitmore's exploitation were truly free.